It's fantastic to be back here. So the other really cool thing, it's just an absolute privilege to see the rising Agile tide that is clearly evidenced by this sold-out event. And this really is a trend that I'm seeing all over the world. Sri Lanka is certainly no exception. I mean, just take this study that came out last year. This was a study some statistics. Over 4,000 organizations globally were surveyed, and 84% of them, like 84% said that they're doing some form of Agile. Okay? That's a lot, and that's really telling us that this Agile game is no longer sitting on the sort of peripheral fringes. It's really moving into that mainstream. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Let's talk about that in a moment. Now, of that 84%, a big part of it is being driven by the most popular of the Agile frameworks, namely Scrum, with about 75% of that 84% saying that they're utilizing Scrum or some sort of Scrum blend. Now, here's the thing. Now, while I agree, this recognition is a good thing, right? It's definitely in the mind space. I can pretty much assure you that a large proportion of that 84% are running what I would call lip service Agile. A little bit warped, So why is that? Why is that? Well, a big reason for it is the lack of quality Agile education. Now, when education isn't good, misconceptions arise. And these are generated by propagated myths that take hold and lead to these warped and even potentially corrupt kind of adoptions. So today, what am I going to do? I want to bust some of these myths up. With popularity, myths spread even further. So I want to try and tackle some of these myths with you today. As a certified Scrum trainer and consultant, I spend most of my time helping organizations with their Scrum adoptions. So the myths I'm going to talk about relate directly to what I'm seeing in the field, working with hundreds of different groups over the last few years. So let's get into it. Let's tackle the first myth. I'm going to just warm us up a little bit. I'm going to warm us up with some terminology myths. Little things. Terms that are thrown around that they tend to drive me a little bit nuts. It's always the little things, all right? It's always the little things. So let's start right at the top. Let's start right at the top with the name of the whole framework here. A lot of people think Scrum is an acronym. I'm going to come back to this rugby reference in a moment. And they spell Scrum like this, in full caps. I assure you, many of you sitting there are doing that right now. Okay? I'm not going to ask for hands, I'll be nice. Now, Scrum is actually not an acronym at all. But here's the thing, right? I've had a go at one of the acronyms. I've made up my own acronym. Anyone who can come up with an awesome Scrum acronym, the first person to come up to me today will get a free copy of my book. How about that? All right? But anyway, Scrum is not an acronym. For those of you who do believe it's an acronym, you may be surprised to hear that it actually comes from the game of rugby. The rugby scrum. Now, what is a rugby scrum? Some of you might be asking. Well, it is a group of burly 250-ish pound rugby players joined together like a jigsaw, like this, right? And what are they doing? They're trying to drive their opposition back and progress towards their score zone or the try line. And by the way, our rugby team is doing a little bit better than it was before. But anyway, by the by. Anyway, it's this idea, this concept of tight, collaborative teamwork that gave birth to the Agile reference that was originally coined and identified by the so-called godfathers of Scrum, as they are affectionately known, Takeuchi and Nanaka, right? And they published in their 1986 groundbreaking paper, The New Product Development Game, describing the analogy of rugby as a preferred option to the more traditional sequential waterfall type approach. Now, hailing from a rugby-loving nation, don't worry, we still love cricket more, okay? Don't worry. Think about the Scrum in the same way as you would look at the ancient Spartan shield-blocking phalanx. Quite impenetrable if discipline is maintained and teammates work as one. Okay, so let's bust our first myth. Scrum is not an acronym. I don't want to see anyone spelling it in full caps. Anyway, little one to start us off. But let's stay on that sort of terminology theme. Let's also stay within the sporting realm here. And another heavily abused term in Scrum, anyone know what it is? It's this one, sprint. Sprint is speed. Now, if I say to you, what does the word sprint conjure up in your minds? Okay, what are you going to say? You're going to say things like this. Breakneck speed, right? Going fast. Unsustainable pace. What happens at the end of a sprint race? People are pretty darn exhausted, aren't they? Pretty darn exhausted. Now, my concern with this is that it gives rise to the myth that Scrum teams are much faster than, the more traditional teams. Traditional teams, they just stroll around, meander, but not Scrum teams. Oh no, they are guns, right? They move really fast. Problem, if I'm to tie this back to that 84% adoption that we discussed earlier, I'm concerned that just little things like that lead this 84%, because you tell me one senior stakeholder that doesn't want to see their teams go so much faster, and they hear things like, ooh, Scrum teams work in sprints, that's really fast, that's going to move us a lot faster. The term sprint, okay, it's that time box, okay? Typically 1 to 2 week time box. It's the Scrum equivalent of the more generically used iteration, right? Now, here's the thing. Scrum obviously subscribes to the Agile Manifesto, and the 8th principle is all about sustainable development, moving at a sustainable pace, not at breakneck speed. Sprint, while it is misused, it's still not a bad word actually, because it's not referring to speed per se. It's talking about distance, short distance that allows you to regularly inspect and adapt and focus on what's right in front of you. What's the opposite of that? The opposite is a long-winded, ongoing marathon. You can't see the finish. You don't know where that's coming up. That's the difference. So please, let's not think about sprints as, hey, our teams are just going to move faster. Scrum teams may or may not go faster than traditional teams, but I'll tell you what they will be faster at doing. This has been touched on a little bit already. Scrum teams will be faster at delivering the highest business value end-to-end features. Why? Because we are baking in quality as we go. We are prioritizing. We will be able to finish end-to-end features without that long lead time that we typically have, where we have to wait for everything to be tested before we get anything. It's that big bang that Henrik referred to before. For myth 2, sprint is not about speed, sprint is about distance. The ability to focus on what's ahead of us and to regularly inspect and adapt. All right, we're warm now, right? Let's move on to some biggies. Here's another myth. The myth being Scrum is an approach just for software. Just for software development. Most people certainly feel that this is the case. And you know what, I'm not going to argue that Scrum was born out of the software industry, absolutely. Scrum was certainly born out of the software industry, but if you read any of the core Scrum guides, you will not see the word software, you will not see the word engineering. Why not? Because Scrum is purposely abstracted above that level. Why? So it can be applied in a whole range of other areas as well. Whole range. There are many documented cases of Scrum being used in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. Warplanes have been developed using Scrum. Cars have been developed using Scrum. Scrum is used in homes. Scrum is used in schools, in religious institutions. We are seeing more and more non-software people turn up to our training courses. It's really interesting. I've recently helped a couple of interesting organizations, a defense agency. They wanted to use Scrum to build a research paper, not a line of code anywhere. Simply putting together, well, it wasn't simple at all, but putting together a research paper. We've helped training organizations, well, recently working with a major media company, helping them put together all of their training materials for their learning and development group. Again, not a line of code in there, but it was about incrementally and iteratively developing a large piece of work, breaking down the problem and validating as they go along. And of course, I've got to practice what I preach. My book, Scrum Shortcuts, was developed in nice vertical slices. Anyone interested in that process, come and have a chat to me during the break. So, Scrum is not just for software. Scrum can be used in all sorts of interesting areas. All right, let's forge ahead. So speaking of books, okay, here's another one. I guarantee you, the vast majority of you have heard this one, okay? Scrum hates documentation. Boo! We don't like documentation, do we? We especially don't like detailed documentation. That's bad. Scrum is anti that. Well, is it? Is it? Well, we use this thing called a user story, this construct called a user story. Don't we use that to try and limit the amount of detail? Keep things super simple so we don't need all those reams of paper, right? You know the user story format, we've mentioned this a few times. And doesn't the Agile Manifesto say that? It says it right there. Hey, we want working software over comprehensive documentation. Awesome, so we don't need documentation, right? Right? Right. Who's heard of this guy? The Agile Cowboy. This myth gives rise to this Agile Cowboy. And his most famous catch cry, we're Agile, we don't need documentation. Who has heard that? Come on. Yeah? How many cowboys in the room? Wear your hats. I know we have some. Here's the problem with these cowboys. They read the manifesto. They read those 4 statements, yeah? That's cool. But they forget a very important footnote that's inherent within this manifesto. The footnote at the bottom goes like this. While there's value in these items on the right, we value the items on the left more. What on earth does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. It means we still need this. We still need the items on the right. We need them. The question you've got to ask yourself is to what extent? The items on the right are a means to an end. They're not the end unto themselves. They need to support our process. They need to support it. Now, if we are a startup, okay? We're a startup, we're working in a garage, there are a couple of us. Do we need to communicate via 200-page spec documents? Do we need to communicate via email? Do we need convoluted tooling to keep track of what's going on? Of course not. That doesn't make sense, does it? But if we are a large multinational, let's say a finance organization, and you know what? Your reality, your constraints, you have to work within various audit standards, ISO, CMMI, Sarbanes-Oxley, whatever it is. Do you know what that means? It means you're going to need more documentation. You know what it also means? You'll need more of everything on the right of the manifesto. More tooling, more processes, that's a reality. But again, I'm still going to implore you to ask that question. To what extent? I need this to support my process. And you know what? A product is not just code. A product isn't even just code and testing. A product could well include, and need to include for real reasons, a whole range of documentation types. Documentation for audits, documentation to help the support teams, documentation for your users. That may be a part of your product, so we don't shy away from it and say we don't document. Quite the contrary, in fact. We say to ourselves, what do we really need? We need to make sure this documentation is being built. We need to factor this documentation potentially into our definition of done, so we are also incrementally building that as we build our product, rather than just leaving it right until the end like we always do, or don't do it all together. That's what we need to think about, because there is a big difference between documentation for our organizational memory moving forward, to help support our product as it goes out there. And the documentation that we use to generate this perception of control, this artificial perception of control up front, where we try to nail that spec on day 0 when we've got the worst possible knowledge we will ever have. So we don't shy away from it. Agile Scrum, it's not about getting rid of documentation and detail. Do you know what it is about? It is about getting the right level of detail, the right level of documentation at the right time. When we know we need to build something, when we know what the requirements are for documentation, the functional requirements, then we think about that. And that's when we can get that detail. Getting it all up front gives us a real lead time problem. So guess what? Scrum is not anti-documentation. Scrum is about saying, what do we really need to make our product sing? And if it includes documentation, we include it. Okay. I mentioned during this segment the idea of the user story. And we've heard that, I think, throughout all the talks. So the user story is a format that we use to help capture our so-called requirements. And the myth, though, is that Scrum teams must use the user story format. That's what Scrum uses. You want to do Scrum, you have to use and utilize that user story format, and everything on your product backlog has to fit that format. So here's the thing, right? This format, I think it is a good format. I think it is helpful. I think it helps us establish the right level of detail at the right time by fostering this conversation. I think it's good, but it is not the only thing you can use. Think about a product backlog. It is not homogeneous. It can be rather cosmopolitan in nature. Perhaps you do like the user story format and you want to use that to capture your functional user requirements. But hey, remember, a product backlog isn't just nice, shiny new features, is it? We will have defects on that backlog. We will have research requirements, technical requirements. You could use different formats for all of those different types if it makes more sense. Again, it needs to be fit for purpose. Some of you might be using something else. Maybe you're using use cases. I don't know. Whatever's working for you. You don't have to use that user story format. It's a nice option. It's something to potentially experiment and try with, but you don't have to use it. So there's a myth for you. You don't have to use it. Now, on that theme, there are another few, call them Agile accessories, okay, that seem to have coupled themselves very, very closely with Scrum. Let me talk about these. Heard of planning poker? Yeah. Heard of the task board? I know you've heard of the task board because we've already spoken about it today. The sprint burn down. Pete spoke about that earlier. These are 3 Agile accessories that many people think are an inherent part of Scrum. And if you want to do Scrum, you need to do all 3 of these things. So let's talk about that first one. What's at the top? Our Scrum troopers, as we call them. Planning poker is, of course, the technique that we utilize to put relative estimation into practice. Now, funnily enough, believe it or not, Scrum doesn't say you even have to estimate at all if you don't need to or want to. Estimation can, if you want to and need to, be applied at that sprint backlog or product backlog level. But if you don't need to or want to, you don't have to do any estimation. Further, if you do want to estimate at the product backlog level, you don't have to use relative estimation. You don't have to use planning poker at all. That's up to you. Again, I personally think that it's a nice technique in context, right? I think it's a good technique. But again, it is an option for you. The task board. Now, the task board has become very synonymous with Scrum. It's that centerpiece. Okay, a lot of people equate Scrum to this task board, but funnily enough, it's not even core. You don't need to use this task board if you don't want to. To be honest with you, I don't work with any teams that don't have some sort of information radiator to help them track their sprints. I think it is a really good idea. It helps us view snapshots and patterns that can really help us understand whether our team is swarming and working well together. But again, it's optional. And how you set up those task boards. I've got 4 columns there. Henrik's had 3 columns earlier. You can have whatever columns you feel like, right, for your Scrum team. It's up to you. As you saw, Henrik's built after those first 3, you can do whatever you like with your task boards. You don't even need to use them. I think the first 2 can be very valuable. This last one here, I know Pete spoke about this. He actually was speaking about individual burn downs. I'm going to talk about the team sprint burn down. This has got for me some questionable value. This for me is a little bit dangerous. Okay? Now, in the past, this used to be a core artifact, right? This used to be something that all Scrum teams would do. And what was it? It was the way to track the progress on a daily basis of the team's progress. Okay? It has since been deprecated. Why? Because it has also become a tool that has been turned and used against the team. It's been a tool that's been used to micromanage. So let me just show you what would happen, right? You would tally up, teams would tally up the tasks, okay, the hours of their tasks for a sprint. They would track it at the top there, and then every day they would tally up with the remaining time to see how they're progressing, right? Burning down to that final day if it's a 2-week sprint, 10 business days. And a lot of teams would do this as well. On day 0, they would draw this theoretical diagonal line, okay, to give you a benchmark to track against, to see if you're on track. Now, the problem is this. A lot of burn downs do this. Does that look like it's burning down to you? It looks like it's kind of burning up, right? Looks like we're actually creating more work. This is actually a really common thing to see. What's going on here? Well, we're jumping in and we're finding things that we didn't expect. Okay? We're finding things we didn't quite realize, and that's okay. And then you hopefully start to burn down. Now, the problem with this theoretical line, the problem with the burn down in general, you get some curious senior stakeholders strolling around the office, and they see something like that. What do they say? They say this. You guys are hopeless. You guys suck. How can you already be this far behind? Not only are you behind, you've actually created more work for yourselves. You barely even started. Then, when that sort of culture begins to permeate, you start to see something like this form. Do you know what this looks like? Looks good, doesn't it? This is telling me this sprint is tracking beautifully on target, mapping perfectly to that theoretical line. When I see that, I immediately smell a rat. I know something's a little bit awry here. I know that there is a culture of fear and teams are not willing to express reality. Or they're baking in a whole heap of buffer in there. Okay? I'm going to come back to this a bit later. I will say though, there is some value in certain teams. It's not all bad. I do like the burnout for 2 things that it can offer us. Firstly, if our team is behind schedule, you can see that a little bit earlier, and it can maybe prompt us to say to ourselves, hey, how can we work better together as a team to swarm, to at least finish something before the end of the sprint, even if we are behind. It also allows us the opportunity, if we're tracking ahead, believe it or not, to say, hey, product owner, we think we might be able to pull something into this sprint, so can we make sure we've got some sprint-ready items up the sleeve, okay? So it can be a good trigger for that. But my message here is, firstly, you don't have to use them. It's not part of core Scrum. And secondly, if you do use them with care. They do deliver some value, but they also come with a bit of cultural risk. So be aware of that. Be aware of that. So yeah, all those things, planning poker, sprint burn down, task board, and earlier the user story, you don't have to use them. Oh, here's one for you. Okay, this one, for me, leads to some serious dysfunctional thinking. This is around the concept of what's commonly known as sprint zero. Okay, sprint zero. Who's heard of that term, sprint zero, before? Yeah, okay, quite a few of you. Now, I'm kind of a little bit gentle on the term in my book, but since the book was published, I've really learned to dislike the term. Okay? Sprint zero. Let's just get on the same page. What are we talking about here? We're talking about this so-called pre-work that we may need to do to get up and running. Okay? Before we jump into the so-called delivery sprints, right? There's a whole bunch of things we must consider, think about. And The problem with the term sprint zero gives this implication that we've got to fit all of that into a sprint. So if we're running in 2-week sprints, hey, it's going to be 2 weeks. Now, firstly, I want to point something out that sprint zero, this pre-work, firstly, the term itself is not a core Scrum term at all. Secondly, it's not a mandated activity that you need to do. I personally think there is a benefit in this pre-game work. I think there are certain activities that you should be thinking about to give yourself the best possible chance of success. Things like generating your initial vision. Why are you doing this? What problem are you trying to solve? What's the whole point? Okay, that's something that we could go into our pre-game activity. Forming the team. Who's on our team? Getting our initial product backlog together. Sure, it may change over time, but we at least have some idea of what we're thinking about. Sourcing and understanding what kind of environments we need. I think that makes sense to put into a sort of pre-delivery period. But the myth that I don't like isn't the fact that you shouldn't have that pre-game work. I call it pre-game activity, right? Before we start the game. I think you do need some of it, right? My problem is this one. Sprint zero, I don't like this term because then you see Scrum being thrown out as this thing only trivial projects can utilize because, hey, you've got to do all this stuff in 2 weeks. We work with telecommunication organizations and banks, and I sometimes go in there and they say, yeah, we can't do Scrum because we can't do the sprint zero thing. I say, that's just nonsense. The idea is that this pre-work needs to be fit for purpose. Like our requirements, like our documentation, we need to think about it. Again, go back to our startup in the garage building an iPhone app. How long is this pre-game work going to take? Hours, maybe a day or two, whatever. Certainly under 2 weeks, yeah? We're working on a very large, again, maybe it's an insurance system, banking system, telco system. I'm afraid to say that work is going to take a lot longer than 2 weeks, and that's not a bad thing. Sure, I want that pre-game work to take as little time as possible because I want to get validating earlier. I want to get validating as quickly as I can, but I also want to be realistic. I don't want to be chasing my tail for the entire duration of this project because we didn't lay some foundation. So again, pre-work I think is important, but maybe don't call it sprint zero. Maybe don't give the perception that, hey, this stuff can all fit into a nice typical sprint, because it may not, and it needs to be fit for purpose. All right, moving through them. Okay. Sprint iteration, they're time boxes. Okay, now Scrum is an iterative approach, and this gives rise to a double-sided myth that I hear. Double-sided myth. Firstly, you must release something at the end of the sprint because you need to have a what? Potentially product increment, a potentially shippable product increment. You must have one every sprint. The problem is, the most operable word here, potentially, is actually forgotten. And people think, hey, we must ship something to production every sprint. I don't like this expression, I don't like this term, because I think it is misleading. This does not actually mean the intent of this isn't you must release something to production. The intent is actually this. You want something that is tested, that is validated and demonstrable, able to be demonstrated every sprint. That's what we're trying to do. We are trying to close feedback loops. We're trying to work in vertical slices so that we can confirm that we're on the right track. This doesn't mean you have to ship to production every sprint. We see a number of options. Some teams, sure, they release to production at the end of the sprint. That's cool, but most teams we work with, to be honest with you, they'll release after multiple sprints. Do you know why? Because it's a commercial decision. The commercial decision on when something is ready for release is something our product owners need to drive, and it may not make sense to release every sprint. We decouple the commercial decision from the iteration. The iteration is about validating, okay, as we go along and verifying as we go along. When we release to production is a commercial decision. This is different. Now there's the other end of the scale, because we also work with teams who can't actually wait until the end of the sprint. Even short 1 week sprints is too late. They must release continuously. So you hear this sometimes. Sure, it's a bit rarer, but hey, Scrum isn't agile enough anymore, right? because we can't wait until the end of an iteration. We need to get out earlier. Again, decouple the idea of releasing out from the iteration. What Scrum is actually saying is that we at least want something that we can demonstrate, that is tested, that is validatable at the end of the sprint. That's what we're saying here. So it's up to you when you actually push things out. Don't have to wait until the end of the sprint, and you certainly don't have to release something to production. You want something that is potentially shippable. Okay? There's a really subtle distinction there. All right, here let's talk about staying with the end of the sprint. Here's another one I hear a lot. The sprint review is the opportunity to engage with the product owner and show them something. Okay? It's a myth. Why? Well, when Scrum first burst onto the scene, sure, that was the case. In fact, a sprint back then was 30 days. That's what that was written. That was what was originally in the Scrum so-called rule book. 30 days, and at the end of 30 days, hey, product owner, guess what? You get to see stuff. And back then it's like, whoa, awesome, because I don't have to wait a year to see something. Isn't that cool? But Scrum also incrementally evolves over time. And now I don't see any long-winded 30-day sprints anymore. But also the review, the sprint review, is utilized these days more to engage with the broader stakeholder community. Who is not, the stakeholder community that's not there day-to-day with the Scrum team. We expect our product owners to be there day-to-day. We expect our product owners to validate within a sprint on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so the review, let's engage with our stakeholders, show them what's going on. Product owners, I want them seeing things as we go along. They do this in an activity known as a walkthrough. Some teams call it a shoulder check. Now, a walkthrough is not a mandated or core Scrum activity. It's become what Mike Cohen tends to call a generally accepted Scrum practice, or a GASP. What is a walkthrough? Think about a walkthrough. It's like a little mini review that happens within the sprint as things get built. We say, hey, product owner, come check this out. Are we on the right track? Doesn't make sense. Is it done? Can we move on to the next thing? Think about that. Again, the theme, close feedback loops as early as we can. We don't wait until the end to show something to our product owner. All right, we are nearly there. Myth 10. Oh, this is an interesting one. I'm going to actually piggyback on what Pete was talking about here. Here's the problem when you go last before 3 awesome speakers. Some of your material goes earlier, so I'm just going to help it along a little bit. I get this question come up a bit. In fact, a bit too often for my liking. And this question is this. It goes like this, right? They say, people come up to me and they say, okay, so our team, they planned this in the sprint planning, and here's the plan, it's the sprint backlog. So if my team does not hit everything in there, well, I can classify that as a failed sprint, right? This is a very simplistic, overly simplistic way of looking at the problem. And let's go back to the origins of where I think this came up, how this is sort of perpetuated over time. So again, back in the day, it was written that the sprint backlog, think of it like the sprint commitment, right? You've heard this term, this is our commitment. And in Schrader's book here, right, where this term was sort of introduced, he actually was referring to commitment being this, a commitment to do your best. Commitment to do your best. That's a good thing. I think that's a good thing, right? Committing to do your best. But over time, what has happened in certain quarters, certain parts of the Agile world, this term sprint commitment has turned into this etched in stone, signed in blood commitment. You establish the sprint backlog, you must hit that. And if you are running behind schedule, guess what you have to do? Crazy amounts of overtime, till your knuckles bleed, right? That's what's happened. So in part to address this, right, we need to think. We need to think about this. There is only one time when we have perfect knowledge about anything. When is that one time? When it is done and dusted. That's when we've got our perfect knowledge. When it's done and dusted. When it's finito. As such, Even a short 10-day plan, which might be our sprint backlog, so a short period of time, it's susceptible to unknowns. It's susceptible to change. It will happen. So a plan can never be a guarantee. Okay? In part, the Scrum Guide has dealt with this. Okay? They try to deal with it by changing the terms, right? It's no longer a commitment, it's a forecast. But still, I get the question, how can I classify my sprint into success and failure? How can I do it? So do you know what I do? I give them a definition of failure. I give them one. Let me give you two scenarios, similar to what Nick was talking about earlier. Let's say we got one team, okay? They planned 5 PBIs, 5 product backlog items at the end of day 10. So they've been working really hard during this sprint. They really have. They haven't been slacking off. They've been working hard. At the end of the sprint, they're 80% through all of them. Okay? 80% through all of them. Sounds pretty good. Let me give you another team. This team, however, same sort of situation. They worked really hard. Things came up, some impediments here and there. They didn't get exactly what they hoped to get done. But what they did, they actually completed 4 out of the 5. They didn't even start the 5th one. Team 1, hey, they did well, right? They at least started everything, nearly got them all done. Second team, hey, they finished 4, but they didn't even start on that 5th one. Which team failed? Which team failed? Team 1 or 2? 2, 1. Interesting. Here's my opinion. My humble opinion is this one. Team 1 failed. Why did Team 1 fail? They don't have anything to show at the end of the sprint. Nothing is tested, demonstrable, validated. Nothing is. There's a lot of work in progress at the end of this sprint. There's a lot. Team 2, on the other hand, I think they swarmed. Why? Because they actually worked together to at least finish 4 increments. They actually worked together. They swarmed. Team 1, why do I think they failed? I think they failed because there was plenty of capacity to at least get something done. If they had worked a little bit smarter and realized, hey, we're not going, something's going wrong here, how can we remobilize? How can we swarm to at least finish something? That would have been better for me. That would have been much better. Now, don't get me wrong. Okay, don't get me wrong. I want my forecast to be as accurate as possible. Okay, I'm not saying, hey, just blow your forecast, who cares about them? I want them to be as accurate as possible, but not at the cost of underachieving. Let me give you a scenario here. Let me say that I'm going to give my teams big fat bonuses. Okay, big bonuses. If they are able to frequently, well, pretty much every time, I want their forecast to marry up exactly with what is delivered at the end of the sprint. I want 100% estimation accuracy. That's what I'm valuing. So because I'm valuing it, I'm giving you big bonuses if you do that every time. Do you know what's going to happen when I do this? I'm going to get exactly that. I'm going to get beautiful packaged up sprints with nice bows around them, mirroring exactly what those sprint forecasts, those sprint plans indicated at the beginning. That's what's going to happen. But guess what else I'm going to see happen? I'll tell you what else I'm going to see happen. I'm going to see teams start to think so conservatively that effort is not going to be maximized. What do I mean? These teams will remain in this nice comfort zone because they're going to be too afraid of overextending themselves and under-delivering. So what's going to happen, they're going to start baking in a lot of buffer. And they will make sure that that sprint plan is nicely, neatly wrapped up at the end of the sprint. Is that what you really want? I don't want my teams doing that. I want my teams pushing boundaries. I want my teams taking some risks. You know what? Sometimes it will work out. Sometimes it won't. So what the hell is the point then of working in these sprints? The point is I want to use the sprint plan as a guide. I want to think of it as the headlights that are shining just ahead of me to show me the detail that's coming up. I want to limit my detailed planning, and so I like the sprint for that purpose. It allows us to create a short-term detailed plan for what's coming up next. It's also a great opportunity to help us work out as a team how we can better swarm. How can we work together to get product increments rolling out sooner? I want us doing less starting, more finishing. Those who said earlier on that the second team failed, well, you know what? Yes, the first team started lots. They did start lots, but they didn't finish. I don't care about starting, I care about finishing. That's what we want to think about during our sprint planning. How can we at least swarm and galvanize to get there? I do not want my teams 100% hitting their sprint targets every time. Funny thing to say, right? I don't want that. If I start seeing my team deliver beautiful packages that mimic their sprint plan, I'm not happy because I know that effort's not being maximized. I know there's a culture of fear. I don't want to see that. Sometimes we'll be over. Sometimes we'll overplan. Sometimes we'll underplan. Okay? I'm okay with that as long as most of the time we're kind of hitting our targets. Even for mature teams, I'm happy with that, providing one thing. Providing we are learning along the way. We don't get our targets, it means something happened potentially. Something maybe we could have done something about, maybe we couldn't have done something about. But I want us using our retrospectives to identify, is there anything we could have learned? Is there anything we could have learned? Okay, so it's a myth, right? That if you don't hit your sprint plan, you fail. I don't want us thinking like that. And our second last myth, here's I would say this one here is the largest operational Scrum issue we're seeing with teams at the moment. I'm not talking sort of systemic problems, I'm talking operational issues. And this myth is the fact that, you know what, we work in these cross-functional teams and we're expected to swarm on the requirements in a sprint. And so the expectation, therefore, is for us to do all of this stuff in the one sprint for a feature, right, or PBI. To do the functional design, the technical design, test design, build and testing, all in the one sprint, right? That is what we need to do, isn't it? Here's the problem though. It leads to two dysfunctions. Firstly, it leads to horrible, arduous sprint planning sessions, and then you start to see tweets like this. I know it's small, but I'm going to read out the last one. I think this is a funny one. Sprint planning all damn day with people who have no clue. Dante's seventh circle of hell is software development. Agile. Now, why does this happen? Well, there's another thing that happens apart from just terrible sprint planning sessions. The sprints go off the rails. They are horribly unpredictable. So why is this? What's going on here? And how does it tie back to the fact, hey, we have to put all of this functional design, test design, development design, building and testing? The main problem is that that functional design for that PBI is often very unpredictable. Why? Functional design often requires a large deal of socialization. What do I mean? I mean working with stakeholders, working with subject matter experts who may unfortunately not be embedded within our development teams. And with socialization, you get bottlenecks and you get unpredictability. And if you try and bake that unpredictability into your sprint, this is what happens. You get delays as people are running back and forth to committees to try and get answers on questions. You get people twiddling their thumbs, waiting around, or building things using guesswork that's going to be wrong. Ultimately, it's just a big mess. So, what I want to start thinking about is actually ensuring the functional design is done before we enter the sprint. In sprint 5, I want my product owners, in conjunction with any of the designers that are helping them out, scouting a bit ahead. In sprint 5, I want them thinking about sprint 6, maybe even a bit about sprint 7. I want that functional design done before we enter sprint planning. I want to know what we are building by the time. Sure, there'll be a few creases to iron out, that's okay, but I want to know what's happening in that sprint planning. I don't want my product owners being 10 sprints ahead. That leads to other issues of waste, of course, but I do want them thinking ahead. I want to make sure when I hit sprint planning, I know what we're building. I want the functional design working a bit ahead. Some people say, when I tweeted that a bit recently, and people go, "Oh, isn't that Scrumful or water Scrum?" It's not, it's just a damn good idea. Because if you go into a sprint not knowing what you're building and just trying to all muck in and self-organize from that perspective, it can get confusing. It can work in certain contexts, but if your functional design is reliant on others that are not working within that team, it can get very counterproductive. So I want us thinking, you know what? The requirement doesn't all need to be end-to-end within that sprint. I want that functional design being fed into it. This is a practice known as backlog refinement or grooming. It's simply saying, hey, I want sprint-ready items sitting at the top of my backlog to get consumed in the next sprint. I want them to be ready. I want them to be understood. I want there to be clear acceptance criteria. I want them in a sprintable time frame. I want them to have been socialized with architects potentially. I want them to be socialized with subject matter experts, stakeholders. I want to tick those boxes before we say, yep, we're going to take this on in the sprint. This leads us to our last myth. Okay, speaking of these cross-functional teams, I'm going to go through this quite quickly because Pete also touched on this one. This is a myth that, hey, Scrum expects every team member within that development team to be completely cross-functional. I want people who are brilliant at functional design, development, testing. Scrum's not actually saying that at all. Scrum is actually saying, I want my teams to be cross-functional. So I don't want to have a team purely focused on functional design and another team purely focused on testing. No, I will have specialists within my team, but I want my team to be cross-functional. Think about them like a SWAT team or a special forces team. Characteristics of this type of team, they're small. Okay? You're talking 4 to 10 people. Do you have specialists in a team like this? Yeah, you do. They are definitely specialists. And look at this guy. This guy's got a shield, the other guys don't. There's certain specialties that you will have in Scrum teams. That's fine. I want to be able to drop my special forces team. I want to drop them in. I want them to be able to complete a small mission by themselves without too much heavy reliance on the outside world. That's the same thing that we want with our Scrum teams. We want them to be able to work on vertical slices of functionality without too much need for others. Okay? That's what we want here. So you will have specialists in that team, sure. You will have specialists. That is okay. That's not a bad thing. But I do want those specialists taking on a different mentality. This is that mentality that was mentioned earlier, having T-shaped skills. Sure, I'm a UX designer, let's say. That's my specialty. That's my deep specialty. But you know what? Is that all I can do? Do I say, hey, I've done the UX design stuff, I'm not doing anything else? No, while I've got my deep specialty, that's the sort of lower part of that team, I'm also trying to establish a broader understanding of other functions. Can a UX designer do some testing with the right guidance? Can they? Can they? Sure, why not? Can a programmer? Yeah, why not? Why is this important? It's important because we will see bottlenecks that appear during our sprints. And if we have this mentality that, hey, I've done my bit, you know, I've done my bit here, it's your problem now, what's going to happen? We're not giving ourselves the best chance of hitting that sprint goal. I want us to be realistic about this though. I want us to be realistic. A UX designer, hey, they may be able to chip in and do some testing, sure. They may be able to chip in and do some technical writing. Would I expect a UX designer to suddenly jump in and help out with some particularly complex multi-threading code? Probably not. Maybe, but probably not. I wouldn't have that expectation. So we be practical about it. We be practical, but the message is this. It's more of a mindset shift than anything else. It promotes this idea of collective ownership of a problem. We are saying each sprint is like a mini project, right? It's a mini project. And we've got a goal for this mini project. How are we going to work together to get there? And if we do things like this, my project, I've done my bit, throw it over the fence, even within a sprint, it's like this is a mini waterfall, not my problem, your problem now, then we're not giving ourselves the best chance. You know what? I want a mentality, I want to develop this T-shaped skills, but I will still have specialists in my team, and that is okay. It's okay. And now to our final myth. Final myth, what is it? This myth is the one that goes like this. After attending a couple of days of training and reading a few books, there should be an expectation that these people who we've paid to go on training should be able to work in these cross-functional teams and develop these beautiful vertical slices, keeping our product in a nice state of readiness with sharp testing automation practices, right? That's all it takes, isn't it? You got to get the CSM thing happening, and that's read a book or two. Yeah, that's good. Guess what? You find it doesn't happen, and then you say to yourself, uh-oh, I can't do Scrum, or I've got to practice that often maligned fake Scrum thing called Scrumbot. Anyone heard that expression? Scrumbot. We do Scrum, but we can't do this. So this is what I hear. We try to do Scrum, but you know what? Occasionally we've got to do a testing sprint. So you know what? We can't do Scrum, or we're doing Scrum. And people say that very embarrassingly, and hey, they get a bit despondent. That's not what I want to see, because guess what? Things take time. You're not going to be perfect on day one. That's okay. That's okay. Scrum would be really hypocritical, right? If it expected that. There's a big difference in my book, my opinion, about what Scrumbot is and what is Scrum in progress. Because Scrum is a work in progress for you, okay? It's something that's going to be ongoing, because you'll never reach perfection, believe it or not. You'll never. It's an intent. Scrum does not say we expect you to be perfect on day one. In fact, you should expect a rocky ride when you start, and that is all good. Why? Because you have that opportunity every sprint to take a breath, step back, inspect and adapt, not just your product. This is what I see teams do. They get hell-bent on inspecting and adapting their product. Think about the process you're working in. Think about Scrum itself in your context, in your organization, in your team. How are you incrementally and iteratively improving Scrum itself? So what? Your first couple of sprints are rocky. You don't get nice increments. Going back to my team before. Okay, their test automation practices are immature right now, but hey, they recognize the importance of them. But because those practices aren't mature yet, you know what? They do have to run some catch-up sprints from time to time. Is that bad? Are they not doing Scrum because they have to do that? No, they've recognized that's important, and they're trying to improve it. They're trying every sprint. How can we get a bit more automated to try and catch that up? That's okay. Their mindset is there. They're trying to improve. That is what is going to happen, and that is okay. Scrum isn't just about following these loops and lists. We have to go back to the intent of it. What is the intent? The intent of Scrum is this. Close your feedback loops as quickly as you can. Technical feedback loops, requirement feedback loops, and continuously improve not just your product, but your process as well, how you work together. If you are thinking like this, then as far as I'm concerned, you're an Agilist. And on that note, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to really thank you. Sorry, before I do that, I want to thank you for inviting me back again. It is so awesome to be back here. I'd like to again congratulate all the organisers. This is not easy to do. We try and do this in Australia, right? And I'm sitting here going, oh, geez, we got a tough task to try and emulate this conference. So guys, congratulations, you're doing awesome work. Thank you again.